1789. A nation bleeds. Armies clash across fertile fields now scorched and barren. Brother fights brother. Neighbor turns against neighbor. And a land that once knew prosperity now knows only the sounds of cannon fire and the cries of the dying. In the midst of this chaos, when every leader calls for more weapons, more soldiers, more blood, one man stands apart. His name is Thomas Jackson. And he believes something radical, something that makes him seem naive or even dangerous to those around him. He believes that wisdom, not warfare, can end this conflict. He has no army. He commands no battalions. He wields no sword. Yet within a few short years, this visionary will accomplish what thousands of soldiers could not. He will bring peace to a war-torn land through the power of his ideas, his words, and his unshakable belief in human reason. This is the story of how one man's wisdom changed the course of history and why his lessons matter now more than ever. To understand Thomas Jackson's achievement, we must first understand the world he was born into. Thomas entered this world in 1743 in the southern region of what would become the United States, in a small farming community in Virginia. His family was neither wealthy nor powerful. His father worked a modest plot of land, growing tobacco and corn to sell at market. His mother managed the household and raised Thomas and his 4 siblings. It was a simple life, but it was relatively peaceful in Thomas's early years. The colonies were still under British rule, and while there were tensions and grievances, outright war seemed distant. Thomas showed unusual intellectual curiosity from a young age. While other boys his age were content to learn farming and little else, Thomas was fascinated by books, by ideas, by questions about how the world worked and why people behaved as they did. His parents, recognizing his gifts, made sacrifices to ensure he received an education beyond what was typical for someone of their social standing. Thomas attended a small school run by a Quaker teacher named Samuel Morris. The Quakers, with their emphasis on peace, equality, and inner reflection, had a profound influence on young Thomas. Samuel Morris taught his students not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also philosophy, ethics, and the art of peaceful resolution of conflicts. He would present his students with moral dilemmas and ask them to reason through different solutions, always emphasizing the importance of understanding all perspectives before making a judgment. Thomas excelled in these exercises. He had a natural ability to see multiple sides of an issue, to find common ground where others saw only opposition. By the time Thomas was 16, he had read widely in philosophy, history, and political theory. He was particularly drawn to the writings of thinkers who emphasized reason, dialogue, and the social contract. Philosophers who argued that human beings were capable of governing themselves through rational discussion rather than through force. As Thomas grew into adulthood, the political situation in the American colonies grew increasingly tense. The British government imposed new taxes, restricted colonial trade, and stationed soldiers in American cities. Resentment grew, and by the time Thomas was in his 30s, the conflict had escalated into open warfare. The American Revolution began in 1775, and the colonies declared independence in 1776. Thomas, now 33 years old, faced a difficult choice. Many of his friends and neighbors were joining the Continental Army, fighting for independence from British rule. The cause seemed just to Thomas. He believed in self-governance and opposed the tyranny he saw in British policies, but he also remembered the teachings of Samuel Morris and the Quaker emphasis on non-violence. Thomas struggled with this dilemma. He wanted to support the cause of independence, but he could not bring himself to take up arms. Instead, he found another way to contribute. Thomas became a mediator and advisor in his local community. As the war raged, it created enormous disruptions in civilian life. Families were torn apart, with some members supporting independence and others remaining loyal to Britain. Property disputes arose as land was confiscated or abandoned. Resources became scarce, and conflicts over food, supplies and money intensified. Thomas stepped into this chaos as a voice of reason. He would sit with disputing parties, listen to both sides, and help them find solutions that addressed everyone's needs. He had a remarkable ability to diffuse tension and to help people see past their immediate anger to their long-term interests. His reputation grew, and people began seeking him out specifically to mediate their disputes. Thomas also began writing essays and pamphlets about the principles of just governance and peaceful conflict resolution. He argued that even in the midst of war, communities needed to maintain internal peace and justice, that the ideals they were fighting for externally needed to be practiced internally as well. If you're intrigued by Thomas Jackson's unique approach to leadership in the midst of war, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who needs to hear about the power of wisdom over warfare. Your support helps us tell these crucial stories of peaceful visionaries who changed history. Now let's continue with how Thomas faced the greatest challenge of his life. The American Revolution ended in 1783 with victory for the colonies, but the peace that followed was fragile and complicated. The new nation faced enormous challenges. There was no strong central government, just a loose confederation of states that often disagreed on fundamental issues. There were disputes over borders, over the distribution of war debts, over trade policies, over the very structure of government. Some leaders feared the chaos would lead to the nation's collapse, or worse, to a new civil war between the states themselves. By 1789, these tensions had reached a critical point. The Constitutional Convention had created a new framework for government, but not everyone accepted it. Some states were on the verge of refusing to ratify the Constitution. Armed rebellions had broken out in some regions as farmers and working people, crushed by debt and high taxes, rose up against what they saw as a new form of tyranny replacing the old. It was in this context that Thomas Jackson, now 46 years old, emerged as a crucial figure. He had spent the years after the Revolution continuing his work as a mediator, and had become known throughout Virginia and the surrounding states as a wise and fair arbiter of disputes. When leaders in his state began discussing how to respond to the growing unrest, Thomas was invited to participate in the deliberations. Many of the leaders wanted to respond to the rebellions with military force, to crush the uprisings before they spread. But Thomas argued passionately for a different approach. He said that violence would only breed more violence, that the grievances of the rebels needed to be heard and addressed, not suppressed. He pointed out that many of the rebels were veterans of the revolution, men who had fought for freedom and now felt betrayed by a government that seemed to care more about wealthy creditors than about struggling farmers. If the new nation responded to these men with violence, Thomas argued, it would be repeating the very tyranny they had fought to escape. Thomas's arguments were persuasive, but they were also controversial. Some leaders saw him as dangerously naive, as someone who did not understand the harsh realities of power and governance. They argued that the government needed to establish its authority, that showing weakness in the face of rebellion would encourage more uprisings. But Thomas had allies, other leaders who were troubled by the prospect of the new nation immediately turning to violence against its own citizens. Together, they developed a strategy. Instead of sending in troops, they would send negotiators, and Thomas Jackson would lead the effort. It was a risky decision. If Thomas failed, if the rebellions continued or spread, those who had supported his approach would be discredited. But if he succeeded, he could prove that there was another way, that wisdom and dialogue could accomplish what violence could not. Thomas's first mission was to travel to western Massachusetts, where a rebellion led by a farmer and Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays had shaken the region. Shays and his followers had shut down courthouses to prevent debt collection and had even attempted to raid a federal armory. The rebellion had eventually been suppressed by local militia, but tensions remained high, and many feared the unrest would reignite. Thomas traveled to Massachusetts with a small group of assistants, all of them trained in mediation and conflict resolution. They did not come armed. Thomas insisted that showing up with weapons would send the wrong message. Instead, they came prepared to listen. Thomas spent weeks in Massachusetts, traveling from town to town, meeting with farmers, with merchants, with local officials, with veterans. He listened to their grievances, their fears, their hopes for the future. He heard stories of men who had fought for independence, only to return home to find themselves drowning in debt, their farms being seized, their families facing starvation. He heard stories of merchants and creditors who had loaned money in good faith and were now unable to collect, facing ruin themselves. He heard stories of officials trying to maintain order while facing pressures from all sides. As Thomas listened, he began to see patterns. The conflict was not simply about debt or taxes or any single issue. It was about trust, or rather the lack of it. The farmers did not trust that the government would protect their interests. The creditors did not trust that they would be paid fairly. The officials did not trust that the people would respect the law. Everyone was operating from a position of fear and suspicion, and that fear was driving them toward confrontation. Thomas realized that his task was not to solve every specific dispute, but to rebuild trust, to create a framework in which people believed that their concerns would be heard and addressed fairly. He began organizing community meetings, bringing together people from different sides of the conflict. At these meetings, Thomas would facilitate discussions, ensuring that everyone had a chance to speak and be heard. He would ask questions, probe assumptions, and gently challenge people to consider perspectives other than their own. He would point out common interests and shared values, helping people see that they had more in common than they thought. One of Thomas's key insights was that most conflicts are not zero-sum games where one side must win and the other must lose. Instead, with creativity and goodwill, solutions can often be found that address everyone's core needs. For example, in the dispute between debtors and creditors, Thomas helped negotiate a system of debt restructuring that gave farmers more time to pay, while ensuring that creditors would eventually receive what they were owed. He worked with local officials to reduce certain taxes that were particularly burdensome, while finding other sources of revenue to maintain essential government services. He pushed for legal reforms that would make the judicial system more accessible and less expensive for common people. None of these solutions were perfect, and not everyone was happy with the compromises. But they were workable, and they were achieved through dialogue rather than violence. More importantly, the process itself began to rebuild trust. People saw that their voices mattered, that the government was willing to listen and respond, and that change was possible without resorting to arms. Thomas's success in Massachusetts brought him to the attention of national leaders. President George Washington, who had been deeply concerned about the rebellions and the fragility of the new nation, invited Thomas to the Capitol to discuss his methods. Washington was a military man, someone who understood the use of force, but he was also pragmatic and open to new ideas. Thomas met with Washington and other leaders, including James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and explained his philosophy of conflict resolution. He argued that the new nation needed to establish not just laws and institutions, but also practices of dialogue and deliberation that would allow disagreements to be resolved peacefully. He proposed the creation of mediators and arbitrators who could be called upon to help resolve disputes before they escalated to violence. He advocated for reforms that would make government more responsive to the concerns of ordinary people, particularly those in rural areas who felt ignored by the elite in the cities. Some of Thomas's proposals were adopted, while others were considered too radical or impractical for the time. But his influence was significant. The principles he advocated, emphasizing dialogue, compromise, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts, became part of the political culture of the new nation, at least in theory. Leaders began to see that maintaining unity required not just the threat of force, but also genuine efforts to address grievances and include different voices in decision-making. Thomas continued his work throughout the 1790s, traveling to different regions where conflicts were brewing. He mediated disputes between states over borders and trade. He worked with Native American tribes and colonial settlers to prevent violence and find mutually acceptable terms for coexistence. He advised local governments on how to structure their institutions to promote fairness and reduce the potential for conflict. He also continued to write, producing essays and books on political philosophy and conflict resolution that would influence thinkers and leaders for generations to come. We're now at the heart of Thomas Jackson's philosophy and practice, and if you're finding his wisdom valuable, please take a moment to subscribe, give this video a like, and share it with your community. In a world still torn by conflicts, Thomas's message about the power of dialogue and understanding is more relevant than ever. Now, let's explore the challenges and opposition Thomas faced as he pursued his vision of peace. Thomas's approach to peacemaking was revolutionary, but it was not without its critics and challenges. Many people, particularly those in positions of power, were skeptical of his methods. They saw negotiation and compromise as signs of weakness, believing that strong leadership required decisive action and the willingness to use force. Thomas faced constant pressure to abandon his principles and accept that some conflicts could only be resolved through violence. One of his most vocal critics was a military leader named General Richard Harrison, who had served with distinction in the Revolutionary War and believed that the new nation needed to establish its authority through strength. Harrison argued that Thomas's emphasis on dialogue and compromise was emboldening those who opposed the government, making them believe that rebellion would be tolerated or even rewarded. Harrison and Thomas clashed repeatedly in public forums and in private meetings with government leaders. The conflict between Thomas and Harrison came to a head in 1793, when a serious dispute arose between Pennsylvania and Virginia over their border. Both states claimed the same territory, and armed militias from both sides were gathering, threatening to turn the dispute into open warfare. The federal government, still weak and uncertain of its authority, was paralyzed, unsure how to intervene without alienating one side or the other. General Harrison advocated for federal troops to be sent to the region to impose a settlement by force if necessary. Thomas argued for a negotiated solution, proposing that representatives from both states meet under neutral mediation to discuss their claims and find a compromise. The debate in Congress was intense. Some representatives supported Harrison's approach, arguing that the federal government needed to assert its authority and could not allow states to resolve disputes through violence. Others supported Thomas, arguing that using federal force against state militias could spark a broader conflict and undermine the fragile unity of the nation. In the end, a compromise was reached. Thomas would be given a chance to mediate the dispute, but if he failed within a specified time frame, federal troops would be deployed. Thomas accepted the challenge, knowing that the stakes were enormous. If he succeeded, it would validate his approach and potentially prevent future conflicts. If he failed, it would not only discredit his methods, but could also lead to the very violence he was trying to prevent. Thomas traveled to the disputed territory and began the painstaking work of bringing the two sides together. The initial meetings were tense and unproductive. Representatives from both states were entrenched in their positions, each convinced of the righteousness of their claims. The historical records were ambiguous, with conflicting colonial charters and surveys that could be interpreted different ways. Thomas realized that a purely legalistic approach would not work, because both sides could cite evidence in their favor, and neither would accept a ruling against them. Instead, Thomas shifted the focus of the discussions. He asked representatives from both states to think beyond their immediate claims and consider the long-term interests of their people. He pointed out that if the dispute led to violence, both states would suffer enormously. Resources that could be used for development and prosperity would be wasted on warfare. Lives would be lost, farms would be destroyed, trade would be disrupted, and even the winner of such a conflict would find itself weakened and impoverished. Thomas then proposed a creative solution. Instead of trying to determine which state had the better legal claim, why not divide the disputed territory in a way that addressed both states' practical needs? He worked with representatives to identify what each state actually needed from the territory, whether it was access to waterways for trade, fertile land for agriculture, or strategic locations for towns. Through this process, Thomas helped the two sides develop a proposal that split the disputed territory roughly in half, with the specific boundaries drawn to maximize the benefits to both states rather than to strictly honor the ambiguous historical claims. The proposal was not perfect, and it required both sides to give up some of what they claimed. But it was workable, and more importantly, it was achieved through dialogue rather than violence. After weeks of intense negotiation, representatives from both Pennsylvania and Virginia signed an agreement accepting the compromise. The border dispute was resolved peacefully, federal troops were not deployed, and Thomas's reputation as a peacemaker was enormously enhanced. General Harrison, to his credit, acknowledged Thomas's success, though he remained skeptical about whether such methods could work in all situations. The resolution of the Pennsylvania-Virginia border dispute became a model for how the new nation could handle conflicts between states. It demonstrated that even deep disagreements could be resolved through negotiation and compromise, and it helped establish a culture of dialogue that would be crucial to the nation's survival and growth. But Thomas's work was far from over. Throughout the 1790s, new challenges continued to arise. The young nation was still finding its footing, and there were deep divisions over fundamental questions about the nature of government, the rights of states versus federal authority, the question of slavery, and America's relationship with European powers. Thomas found himself called upon again and again to mediate disputes and offer counsel. One of the most difficult challenges he faced involved the question of slavery. Thomas had been raised in Virginia, a slave-holding state, and he had grown up surrounded by the institution, but his Quaker education and his own moral reasoning had led him to oppose slavery. He saw it as fundamentally incompatible with the principles of liberty and equality that the nation claimed to stand for. However, Thomas also recognized that slavery was deeply entrenched, particularly in the southern states, and that any attempt to abolish it would face fierce resistance and could tear the nation apart. Thomas struggled with how to address this issue. On one hand, his commitment to dialogue and peaceful resolution made him reluctant to take positions that would polarize people and make compromise impossible. On the other hand, his moral convictions made it difficult for him to remain silent or to treat slavery as just another political issue to be negotiated. Thomas decided on a strategy of gradual persuasion. He would argue against slavery in his writings and in private conversations, making the moral and practical case for its abolition. But he would also work to find immediate steps that could improve the lives of enslaved people and lay the groundwork for eventual emancipation. He advocated for laws that would limit the expansion of slavery into new territories, ban the international slave trade, improve conditions for enslaved people, and make it easier for individuals to gain their freedom. These positions made Thomas unpopular in some quarters. Abolitionists thought he was too cautious and too willing to compromise on a fundamental moral issue. Defenders of slavery saw him as a threat and worked to undermine his influence. Thomas also faced personal challenges during this period. The constant travel and stress of his work took a toll on his health. He suffered from recurring bouts of illness, and there were times when he was so exhausted that he considered retiring from public life. His wife Sarah, whom he had married in 1768, was a constant source of support, but she also worried about the toll his work was taking. Thomas and Sarah had 3 children, and Thomas often felt guilty about the time he spent away from his family. He struggled to balance his commitment to his public work with his responsibilities to his wife and children. In letters to friends, Thomas sometimes expressed doubt and frustration. He wondered whether his efforts were making a real difference, whether the conflicts he helped resolve would have been resolved anyway, whether his vision of a nation governed by reason and dialogue was realistic or just a naive dream. But despite these doubts, Thomas continued his work. He believed that even if his efforts only prevented a small amount of suffering, even if they only moved the nation slightly closer to his ideals, they were worthwhile. By the turn of the century, Thomas Jackson was widely recognized as one of the most important figures in the new nation, though his fame was of a different kind than that of soldiers and politicians. He had not won battles or held high office, but he had helped shape the political culture of the nation in profound ways. His emphasis on dialogue, compromise, and peaceful conflict resolution had become part of how Americans thought about governance and citizenship. He had demonstrated through his own work that wisdom could be as powerful as weapons, that understanding could be as important as authority, and that lasting peace required not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice and the capacity for different groups to coexist and cooperate. Thomas's writings were widely read and discussed in educated circles. His mediation services were sought after not just in America, but also in other countries facing conflicts. He corresponded with thinkers and leaders around the world, sharing ideas and learning from their experiences. If you've made it this far through Thomas Jackson's remarkable story, it's time for one final call to action. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, hit that like button, and share this video with everyone you know. Thomas's wisdom about peace, dialogue, and the power of understanding over force is a message the world desperately needs today. Now let's bring Thomas's story to its conclusion and explore his lasting legacy. As Thomas Jackson entered his 60s, he began to slow down. The years of constant travel and intense work had worn down his body, and he suffered from various ailments that made it difficult to maintain his previous pace. In 1805, at the age of 62, Thomas decided to retire from active mediation work. He and Sarah settled in a small town in Virginia, where Thomas spent his final years writing and mentoring younger people who were interested in conflict resolution and political philosophy. Thomas used his retirement to write his magnum opus, a comprehensive treatise on the principles of peaceful governance and conflict resolution titled Wisdom and Peace, Foundations for a Just Society. The book, published in 1808, synthesized everything Thomas had learned from decades of practical experience and deep reflection. In it, he laid out a systematic approach to understanding conflicts, identifying their root causes, and developing solutions that address the legitimate needs and interests of all parties. Thomas's central argument was that most conflicts arise not from fundamental incompatibilities, but from misunderstandings, fear, and the absence of effective mechanisms for dialogue and problem-solving. He argued that human beings are capable of reason and empathy, and that if given the right conditions, they will generally choose cooperation over conflict. The key, Thomas wrote, was to create institutions and practices that facilitated dialogue, ensured fair processes, and held leaders accountable for seeking peaceful solutions. Thomas also wrote extensively about what he called the virtues of the peacemaker, the qualities that he believed were essential for anyone seeking to resolve conflicts. These included patience, the ability to listen without judgment, humility in recognizing the limits of one's own perspective, courage to stand firm on matters of principle while remaining flexible on matters of detail, and wisdom to distinguish between the two. Thomas argued that these virtues could be cultivated through practice and reflection, and that every citizen, not just leaders, had a responsibility to develop them. Wisdom and Peace was Thomas's final major work, and it became his most influential. The book was read by politicians, judges, clergy, educators, and ordinary citizens. It was translated into multiple languages and circulated internationally. Thomas's ideas influenced the development of diplomatic practices, legal systems, and educational curricula. His emphasis on dialogue and peaceful conflict resolution became part of the intellectual foundation for later movements, promoting international cooperation, human rights, and nonviolent social change. Thomas Jackson died in 1812 at the age of 69. His death was mourned by people across the nation and around the world. Newspapers published tributes celebrating his life and work. Former presidents, including Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, wrote letters praising Thomas's contributions to the nation. Ordinary people who had been touched by his work, whose conflicts he had helped resolve, shared their stories of how Thomas had changed their lives. Thomas was buried in a small cemetery in his Virginia hometown, and his gravestone bore an inscription that he had written himself. He sought peace through wisdom and found it in understanding. The inscription captured the essence of Thomas's life and work, his belief that true peace was not imposed through force, but achieved through mutual understanding and respect. In the years and decades following Thomas's death, his legacy continued to grow. His methods of conflict resolution were studied and refined by later generations of mediators and diplomats. His writings remained influential in political philosophy and ethics. Stories of his mediation work became part of American folklore, taught to schoolchildren as examples of wise leadership. But perhaps Thomas's most important legacy was the example he set. He showed that it was possible to be a leader without wielding military or political power. That influence could come from wisdom and integrity, rather than from force or wealth. He demonstrated that even in the most difficult circumstances, even in the midst of violence and chaos, there were alternatives to warfare, alternatives that required patience, creativity, and courage, but that could achieve more lasting and just results. The principles Thomas articulated and practiced remain relevant to this day. In a world still torn by conflicts, from local disputes to international wars, Thomas's emphasis on dialogue, understanding, and peaceful resolution offers a path forward. His work reminds us that violence is not inevitable, that conflicts can be resolved without winners and losers, and that the most powerful weapon we have is not military might, but human reason and compassion. Thomas understood something that many leaders still struggle to grasp, that true strength lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the ability to bring people together, to find common ground, to build consensus, and to create conditions in which everyone can thrive. He understood that lasting peace cannot be imposed. It must be built, piece by piece, through patient work that addresses grievances, builds trust, and creates systems that are perceived as fair by all parties. Thomas Jackson's story also teaches us about the importance of moral courage. It would have been easier for Thomas to go along with the prevailing wisdom of his time, to accept that violence was sometimes necessary, to use force when dialogue became difficult. But Thomas held to his principles even when they were unpopular, even when he faced criticism and mockery, even when his approach seemed unlikely to succeed. He believed that if he compromised on his core values, he would lose the very foundation of his work. This does not mean Thomas was inflexible or dogmatic. He was willing to compromise on many things, to accept partial solutions, to work incrementally toward his goals. But on the fundamental question of whether conflicts could and should be resolved peacefully, he would not waver. This combination of principled commitment and practical flexibility was key to his success. Today, as we face our own conflicts and divisions, we would do well to remember Thomas Jackson's example. Whether the conflicts are political, social, economic, or personal, the principles he articulated remain applicable. We can choose to listen rather than shout, to understand rather than condemn, to seek common ground rather than to emphasize differences. We can approach disagreements with the assumption that the other side has legitimate concerns and interests, not just that they are misguided or malicious. We can create spaces for dialogue where people feel safe to express their views and to engage with views different from their own. We can support institutions and processes that promote fairness, transparency, and accountability. And we can cultivate in ourselves the virtues that Thomas identified as essential for peacemaking: patience, humility, courage, and wisdom. Thomas Jackson's vision of a society governed by reason and dialogue rather than by force and fear remains aspirational. We have not achieved it, and perhaps we never fully will. Human nature includes not just reason and compassion, but also fear, greed, and tribalism. Conflicts will always arise. But Thomas showed us that we have a choice in how we respond to those conflicts. We can choose escalation or de-escalation, violence or dialogue, domination or cooperation. And our choices matter. They shape not just the outcome of individual conflicts, but the kind of society we create and the kind of people we become. Thomas believed that human beings were capable of better, that we could transcend our baser instincts and build societies based on justice and mutual respect. His life was a testament to that belief, and his work proved that it was not just an idealistic dream, but a practical possibility. As we reflect on Thomas Jackson's life and legacy, we are challenged to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of society do we want to build? Are we willing to do the hard work of dialogue and understanding, or will we take the seemingly easier path of conflict and division? Thomas's story reminds us that the path of wisdom and peace is not easy. It requires patience, courage, and constant effort. But it is also the only path that leads to lasting peace and genuine justice. The conflicts of 1789 may seem distant to us now, but the human dynamics underlying those conflicts are timeless. People still struggle for resources, for recognition, for power. Groups still clash over values and interests. Nations still go to war. But in every generation, there are also people like Thomas Jackson, people who refuse to accept violence as inevitable, who work tirelessly to find peaceful solutions, who believe in the power of wisdom to transform even the most intractable conflicts. Thomas's legacy calls us to be those people in our own time and place. We may not be mediating disputes between states or preventing rebellions, but we all face conflicts in our lives, in our families, in our communities, in our societies. We all have opportunities to choose dialogue over confrontation, understanding over judgment, cooperation over competition. We all have the potential to be peacemakers, to use our wisdom and our compassion to heal divisions and build bridges. Thomas Jackson showed us that one person, armed only with wisdom and guided by principles of justice and peace, can change the world. His example continues to inspire and guide us, reminding us of what is possible when we commit ourselves to the path of peaceful resolution, when we refuse to give in to despair or cynicism, and when we hold firm to the belief that a better world is not just a dream, but a goal we can achieve through patient, persistent, wise action. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Thomas Jackson, the visionary who brought peace to a war-torn land through wisdom alone. If his story has inspired you, if his principles resonate with you, if you believe that wisdom and dialogue are more powerful than weapons and warfare, please subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with everyone in your network. The world needs more people who understand what Thomas understood, that peace is not weakness, that dialogue is not surrender, that seeking to understand others is not betraying your own values. These are lessons we desperately need in our polarized, conflict-ridden world. Share Thomas's story, discuss his principles, apply his methods in your own life, and together, perhaps we can continue the work that Thomas Jackson began more than 2 centuries ago. The work of building a world where wisdom prevails over violence, where understanding bridges divides, and where peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice, respect, and human flourishing. Thomas's vision lives on in everyone who chooses the path of peace. Will you join us in carrying it forward?